Welcome to this session on Comics of the New Europe, which is a collection of articles about comics from East Germany, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, former Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine. It is much easier, I think, to say New Europe. As I said, we have both editors and one of the participants here. We're going to start with José Alaniz. I can't say how much of a pleasure it gives me to introduce José Alaniz in this particular format, because I feel like the Jose and I go way back. We go way back virtually, far longer than we go back in person, because I remember seeing his byline on the English language press somewhere in Russia, I believe in the 90s. Jose is one of my favorite scholars.
That's way back.
Way back, yes. One of my favorite scholars, because sometimes I have to remind myself that Jose really does exist, because he seems like a figment of an Amazon algorithm that is designed to throw together every single scholarly thing I might want to read about under one person's name. He is a professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Washington, Seattle. His first book is called Comics, Comic Art in Russia. His second, Death, Disability, and the Superhero, The Silver Age and Beyond, both from University of Press in Mississippi. He also is a comics practitioner. He recently came out with a collection of his own comics called The Phantom Zone and Other Stories, which I highly recommend. I got an author's copy that I was very happy to have and read. He chaired the executive committee of the International Comics Art Forum from 2011 to 2017, and his research interests include cinema studies, death and dying, disability studies, critical animal studies, and comic studies. So Jose, please, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you, Elliot, everybody. Gosh, I feel like I should just have you with me everywhere to introduce me, like into every room that I enter, because I think that was fabulous. Thank you, and of course, I have been a longtime admirer of your own work, and I'm very happy to see you also doing more actual comic scholarship with your recent work on Marvel comics, and I hope that continues very, very much so. Let me share my screen with you guys. Hopefully I can do that without an issue. So you should be seeing the cover of the book now. Is that right?
Not yet.
I always ask for confirmation first.
There it is.
You got it?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the cover of the book. And as we mentioned in our introduction, the book has the kind of origin that I think is not that uncommon, in that it really started with a drink that Martha and I were having at an MLA, I believe 2016 or 2017, and we were just kind of batting around different project ideas, and then and please correct me, Martha, this is different from your recollection, but I remember it was kind of both of us stumbling on this and saying, hey, you know, I wanted to do something looking at comics of the Eastern European or the former Soviet bloc, or whatever you want to call it, the region. And says, hey, I wanted to do that too. And since both Martha and I have been writing on Czech comics for a number of years, we discovered that we have this motivation and this interest to do a project like this in common. And so that's really how it went. So I really think that we produced this volume together with all the collaborators, contributors in record time. I mean, it really just all went very, very quickly and very smoothly. So I'm very happy that it all came together. And there's no way that certainly that I could have done this on my own, even though it was something that I had thought of maybe trying to do for a long time. So I'm happy that Martha and I had that synchrony there. So it's called Comics of the New Europe, Reflections and Intersections. The cover is by Martha, and maybe Martha will want to talk about that cover since she produced that work. And so, as Elliot said, we were interested in looking at a number of these countries that you see depicted on the map: Ukraine, Romania, East Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. So it was part of course, and we get into this a lot in the introduction. I won't bore you with that, but we get into questions in the introduction on seeking to justify our choices, justify why this region, why it's important, the paucity of English language scholarship on this region to this day, and to invite the reader and other scholars to follow us and to expand and to supersede some of what we have been doing here. So we're very happy with the results. Given that, of course, there were some hard choices that had to be made, and some gaps that are obviously still in evidence. Most especially, I would say the fact that we don't have any articles devoted to the Baltic countries. I think there's a whole lot of scholarship that still needs to be done about that area. But overall, I was very happy with the results, and I thought we produced a pretty good volume. The other thing that I thought was important is that in the introduction, we managed to highlight a couple of the artists that are working today in the region that I think are of particular note, particularly for their transnational approach to their comics practice. Figures like Lucia Lomova of the Czech Republic, who writes in both English and Czech, and who works actually all over the continent, doing residencies and other things like that, but also maintains a blog and a kind of online diary. And all of these things really are taking a very transnational, I think, kind of approach to what it is to make comics in the 21st century. Speaking from a place, right, of her Czech nationality and culture, but also I think speaking to the world and contributing to it in I think fascinating and charming ways. Same thing for Anna Kirston from Poland, who is obviously from a younger generation. She was born in 1988, but she is someone who again is a wonderful comics diarist who traces her journeys through the continent and the various kinds of cross-cultural encounters that she experiences. So these are the kind of artists, I think, certainly for the part of the book that deals with artists of the present day that are, I think, characteristic of this of these kinds of comics that are being produced in the region today, particularly the ones that are engaging with both within and without the region, itself. So those were some of the things I wanted to highlight from our introduction. And if Martha, my co-editor, feels like she wants to highlight other things, I certainly welcome that. But let me go on to my own chapter from the book. In my own work, my own contribution, I look at the work of Igor Baranko, what I call Igor Baranko and national precarity in Ukrainian comics. I'm not going to go through the entire kind of argument. I'll go fairly quickly. And of course, we have other people who are speaking. But let me at least say a couple of words about what led me to this project and why I took this particular approach. There's been very little English language scholarship on Ukrainian comics, or really scholarship in any language. I guess there's more now since the time I started this article, but there's still really not that much. And the Ukrainian scene is still very, very young in all sorts of ways. So I wanted to highlight in particular something that goes back to my reading of Oksana Zabushko's novel, Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, where she says, Ukrainian choice is a choice between non-existence and an existence that kills you. This fundamental sense of a precarity that she and other Ukrainian cultural figures articulate, that has to do with Ukrainian national identity in general, a country that is always feeling itself under threat of invasion or of other kinds of interventions from other powers. And so that even being highlighted in the national anthem of Ukraine, Ukraine's glory has not yet died, nor her freedom, right? So we're still here. We're not gone yet. So there's this kind of sense of a contingency and anxiety that seems built into a lot of this material. I don't need to explain to most people who follow the Jordan Center, belong to the Jordan Center, right, the various revolutions and various calamities that have befallen Ukraine in recent years, from the Orange Revolution, and again to the 2014 Euromaidan revolution, and the strife going on, of course, to this day between Russia and Ukraine, especially Eastern Ukraine, and the various ways in which Russia has been basically interfering in the internal affairs of Ukraine. And again, its approach to it as a near abroad former principality, if you will. So all of that, I think, is informing a lot of what the comics are doing in a lot of Ukrainian material these days. Sergei Plokhy, of course, is obviously a leading scholar in this area who talks about this, particularly about Russian aggression and the ways that historically Ukrainians have certainly felt that that knocking on their door, so to speak, from the East and from Russia, and the ways that they've had to kind of negotiate it over the years. The other parts of the book or of the article that I deal with rely on the scholarship on magical realism, given that both of the graphic novels by Baranko that I analyze are dealing with alternate realities and various forms of magical realism. I'm particularly attracted to Frederick Jameson's well-known articulation of magical realism as history with holes or perforated history. So, and then I go further into in the article on the question of historicity itself, and comics relying on scholars like Hilary Shute. And again, there's been a lot that's been written by these folks and others on the particular ways that comics, through their juxtapositional, imagistic, and multimodal grammar, are able to deal with questions of history in sometimes quite explicit and startling and unique ways. And that's, I think, an important characteristic of Baranko's work as well. I go through a few of other examples of work like Dahopak from Maxim Krasalov, Alexei Chebikin, and Alia Kolov. That is a series of Ukrainian graphic novels that are utilizing Ukrainian history, particularly the image of the Cossacks as a national symbol, in ways that is also, I think, evident in other countries' comics practices from this region, and that relying it to connecting it to previous examples, for example, from Repin's painting and other things like that. But again, I don't want to get into everything here. I talk a little bit about alternative histories and relying on the work of Kathleen Singles. The ways in particular, as she says at the bottom of this quote, the point of divergence in these alternate histories is often relying upon the principle of contingency, but the continuing variance from the normalized narrative of the real past, that is the rest of the narrative after that big historical difference, relies on the principle of necessity. That's certainly very true, actually, in Baranko's work, that there will be one major change, whether it is, or actually in not only in Baranko's, but a lot of the other work from the region, from Ukraine. For example, The Will by Vyacheslav Bukayev, which is a steampunk alternate reality of the Ukrainian People's Republic from 1917 to 1921. So that part is different, right? It's got zombies, it's got steampunk, it's got all of this other kind of bizarre technology and situations, but the fundamental conflict, right, and the fundamental politics of the Ukrainian People's Republic remains largely the same. It's still a very blazingly nationalist work in that regard. However they want to dress it up. And that's also true for a lot of the work of Igor Baranko, who to my mind is really giving voice to that sense of national precarity over and over and over in so many of his works. He's the best known and most published and most translated Ukrainian comics artist, and he's been around actually for a number of years working for such major international concerns as Humanoids Press and Metal Hurlant, Slave Labor Graphics, all of these folks. And again, he often will use elements of Ukrainian history and culture in his graphic novels. He's very prolific and does some incredible work. So I knew when I wanted to write about Ukrainian comics, I knew that probably Baranko was going to be my go-to choice because he's such a major and dominant figure, and yet there was really no major article on him that I could find in English. So so I look at two of his works, Shamanism, which is a fascinating alternate history of the North America in which the European conquest never happens. And so it's a meticulously researched and beautiful graphic novel that's looking at the many different nations, First Nations of the continent, but all of it is oriented towards this notion of trying to keep the history that they're living in from staying that way, because the history of the conquest is always trying to come back, right? And so he goes through a number of episodes where he's trying to change the history to maintain his preferred timeline. And so we go over and over this episode of him trying to steal a princess from another tribe, and so that has a determining effect on the timeline. And so it's a fascinating work because, of course, every time you have a different result, so there's a kind of loop effect. that is involved here with the ghost dance. All of that I am trying to argue is also just talking about the very precarity of not only of the nation but of history. A much more, I think, explicit evocation of this notion of national precarity in Ukrainian culture is jihad. From originally 2003, 2004, it is later redone and revised in 2013. And this is the work that is dealing head on with the question of Ukraine and Ukraine's place in history, and how Ukraine is always on the verge of disappearing, of being swallowed up, of being consumed by other powers, whether they are supernatural or whether they are, of course, the various conquerors from the East. In the 7th century, the Scythians; in the 3rd century AD, the Huns, right? And then later on, the Mongols in the 13th century. So it's pages like this, right, where I think you could really see what scholars like Hilary Shute and others have said about the way that comics can represent history. In this case, a kind of cyclical sense of history, how there's always invaders coming, there's always new people that are there to threaten your borders, to overwhelm your borders. And basically here we cover, millennia within the course of 3 panels. So that's the kind of thing that Baranko, I think, is most interested in. Other things that are, I think, important are the ways that he is really pressing on this question of Ukrainian-Russian relations, and how a number of the characters who are Russians are there to try to undermine the government. They're there to seize power. And in this case, as you see, and this is from the translation, where a Russian character is listening to Ukrainian raider, and his first comment is, "I hate Ukrainian. It sounds like a parody of Russian. Why do we still have to put up with their independence, et cetera, et cetera." And this is dialogue that would not be out of place coming out of the mouths of some people in Russia even today. Some people that I know personally, in fact. And so, yeah, this whole idea that Ukrainian is some kind of pseudo version of Russian, or that Ukraine itself is properly and historically speaking, right, it should be this Novorossiya kind of way of thinking about Ukraine. And then so you have, again, these sorts of questions that come up over and over. The most nationalist Russian character who is there as an agent trying to seize power in Ukraine is Ilya Serbin, kind of a funny name. And as he says at one point, "Pathetic little nation, can you even comprehend what empire means?" This is also a significant scene towards the end of the graphic novel, because it is happening within Kiev's Motherland Monument, which looks like this. So, right, I think it makes a lot of sense that Baranko sets the culminating action within this relic of the Soviet era. It is a monument to World War II, of course, but that was dedicated in 1981. But it's still there as part of the Kievan landscape, cityscape. So you see it rendered here. And so it also becomes a kind of nexus of different alternate realities that will determine the course of history going forward. So there's a lot of stuff there dealing with, again, the living past this sense of national disgrace represented by the monument, the infiltration of the monument, and the enduring sense of a kind of neo-colonialist or anti-colonialist, I should say, struggle against powers like Russia, which suffuses Jihad by Igor Baranko. So anyway, that is basically what I was going to say, and I'm happy to take any other questions. But as I said, Jihad in the work of Igor Baranko, I think better than any other that I've read in coming from Ukraine, is really involved with this question, really obsessively, about Ukrainian choice being a choice between non-existence and an existence that kills you. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. Of all the things that are going to be discussed today, Jihad is one of the comics that is easiest to find, and I think is quite rewarding. So everybody should go out and take a look, and go find it. Next up, we have Elizabeth Biz Nijdam. Now, Biz and I don't go back quite as far as José and I do. We met at 450 today, but already I feel like I know her. I'm already a big fan of her work from reading her contribution to this collection. Biz is an assistant professor in German studies in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. She's also an SHRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, working on her book manuscript, Paneled Pasts, History, Media, and Memory in the German graphic novel, which is under contract with Ohio State University Press. Biz's research and teaching interests include the representation of history in comics, comics and new media on migration, and comics as a feminist methodology. She also sits on the executive committee of the International Comics Arts Forum and the executive board for the Comic Studies Society. So Biz, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to Jose and Martha for inviting me to participate. I'm one of the contributors of this volume, so I'm sandwiched between the editors, and my presentation will be a little bit different because I didn't envision the book as such. So I'm going to frame and present an excerpt from the chapter that I contributed to this volume, and then connect a little bit to the larger book project from which it came from. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Can everyone see my title slide? Let's see some thumbs up. Excellent. I'm shifting into teaching very quickly so you can already hear it. Thumbs up, everyone. Okay. The year 2009, which marked the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, saw the publication of 3 graphic novels narrating individual histories of the German Democratic Republic. Simon Schwarz's Drüben, or The Other Side of the Wall, recounts his parents' decision to leave East Germany in the 1980s. Claire Lenkova's Grenzgebiete, or Border Zone, is a children's comic book that helps young readers understand the divided nation that defined their parents' generation. Lastly, Flix's Da war mal was, There Was Once Something There, is a collection of humorous anecdotes from both sides of the wall. Directed at young adults who witnessed the collapse of the GDR but were too young to understand the complexity of their country's separation, these 3 publications visualized the experience of living in East Germany through the children that resided there. They presented the state's oppressive politics and contradictions through anecdotes about growing up in East Germany, while also relating historically accurate facts about life in the GDR through footnotes. Drüben, Grenzgebiete, and Da war mal was launched a movement that has since evolved into a new genre of the German graphic novel. As more comics thematizing East Germany began to appear, what started as a commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2009 quickly turned into a trend in the representation of East German experience. Today, there are over 20 graphic novels that retell the history of the GDR, with more coming out every year. Within this emergent genre of autobiographical, fictional, and non-fictional graphic narratives on East German history, my chapter identifies a subgroup, which I have termed graphic historiography. Decidedly a niche phenomenon, this category consists of some half-dozen comic works that bear striking similarities, namely the extensive use of archival images, documents, and sources. Furthermore, I would argue that this body of graphic literature comments on the very process of historical writing, hence its categorization as historiography, which is both the study of historical writing as well as the processes of it. Typically not produced by East Germans, but about East Germans, these texts differ in tone, strategies, goals, and strategies from the autobiographical and semi-autobiographical graphic novels by the 3rd generation of East Germans who authored these texts. They feature graphic narratives that describe important events in East German history, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the People's Uprising of 1953, in addition to well-documented aspects of living in the GDR, such as the strict censorship, political oppression, and attempts to flee. Moreover, these graphic novels are heavily researched, with traces of that process clearly signaled within the texts themselves. They were all in fact produced in collaboration with experts in East German history and with the support of German pedagogical, political, or historical foundations. Graphic historiography thereby emerges not just as artistic creations by individuals or groups of individuals, but also as part of various institutional projects that seek to commemorate and communicate the history of East Germany to a wider public. And as you'll know, as readers potentially of the volume in which this is published, you'll know this isn't a trend that's only found in post-Soviet Germany. It's something that's happening in wider post-Soviet Europe. In turn, the programmatic nature of these endeavors incorporates the graphic novels themselves into the archives from which they emerge as part of the institution's collections. Of the examples of graphic historiography I've encountered, Berlin geteilte Stadt, or Berlin, a city divided, makes the most concerted effort to mobilize the archive. In addition to heavily researched contextual information at the end of each chapter that articulates the historical and political situation in which the biographical episode takes place, Susanne Buddenberg and Thomas Henseler reproduced archival documents within the chapters, within the individual chapters, and detailed renderings of archival artifacts in the introduction to each chapter. They also engage photography for plot points and reference material. Using Berlin Divided City as a case study, my chapter in Comics of the New Europe assesses the role of the archive in aesthetic and narrative strategies in representing history, demonstrating how its deployment in graphic narrative gestures towards the veracity of comics historical presentation, while undermining the idea of authentic representations of history altogether. I thereby argue that subjective interpretations of historical events in the comics form, even when fictionalized, are an important avenue for imparting historical experience. With particular interest in the graphic narrative's use of archival photographs, which emerge at the discursive intersection of comic scholarship on authenticity and the myth of photographic truth, I posit that the hand rendering of archival documents simultaneously draws attention to the constructed nature of comics and the obscuring quality of photographic mediation. Drawn photography and comics on historical subjects thereby function as symbols for the artifice of historical writing, demonstrating that history itself is also a construction which relies heavily on narrative structures, temporal signifiers legible to contemporary readers, mediation, and memory. This work actually, and to frame the work that was published in this particular chapter, comes out of the ongoing research for my book project, in which I examine this category of graphic narrative on East German history more broadly. So instead of how you typically see research on the relationship between history and comics, in which there's a comic that we then examine how it presents history, I've kind of flipped this on its head by looking at an entire category of history and then looking at all of the comics that emerge, thematizing that period of history. Beyond looking at markers of historical authenticity in these comics, this larger project investigates how comics on East German experience that focus on objects of historical significance can be set in dialogue with museum practice. In addition to a close examination of the archival objects, such as those found in Berlin, a city divided, this project also examines the role of the most visible objects of East German everyday culture, which were collected in German museums after 1989 and have since appeared in comics and graphic novels in East German experience. I posit that their appearance in graphic narrative maps on to social justice-oriented exhibition practices that attempt to build community and acknowledge lived experience through material culture. Moreover, I demonstrate how this body of graphic literature engages with discourses around East German memory culture and consumer products to intervene in debates on the fetishization of East Germany's everyday artifacts. In this context, I situate the materiality of East German memory culture in terms of the Ostalgie phenomenon, which is a combination of the word Ost, meaning East, and Nostalgie, which means nostalgia, before I turn to the presentation of these same objects in United Germany's cultural institutions and comics and graphic novels. Looking particularly at material culture objects in Berlin, a city divided, and Marvel's Kinderland, a childhood in East Berlin, which was recently translated into English, as well as other graphic novels such as Drüben, Das Upgrade, and Berliner Mythen by Reinhard Kleist. This project interrogates the mobilization of consumer products.
I couldn't hear what you said.
Of the East German everyday culture, alongside archival documents and museum artifacts in the service of historical understanding, by setting their appearance in comics in explicit dialogue with conventions and exhibiting East German material culture and history in museums. By looking at these as comics as a kind of curated museum experience in their own right, in the sense that they place objects on display in an effort to communicate something about history, this project ultimately advocates for the position of comics in discourses on East German memory culture, as well as for comics in conversations on historical representation more broadly. And to return to that slide that I just showed you to give you an example of some of this work that the other parts of my book project is doing, you can see examples of the same objects in East German museums of material culture, which are relatively popular throughout all of United Germany, as well as in one particular comic book, Marvel's Kinderland, which opens with a series of silent panels looking at objects of East German historical experience. So yeah, I look forward to your comments and questions, but in the meantime, we can move on to the other editor of this fantastic volume.
Great. Thank you. Okay, you could share your screen, please?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so our final presenter is co-editor of the collection, Martha Kuhlman. Now, Martha and I also go back quite a ways. When I first came to NYU, Martha was one of my first graduate students. She was one of 2 comp lit students who were sort of orphans because they were working on Eastern Europe, and I got them, and I'm very happy about that good fortune. Back then, Martha was working on what would become a dissertation on crowds and modernism, which is excellent work, and was not working on comics. And I want to stress that it's a strange coincidence that Martha then went on to make this incredible career for herself as a comics scholar, and I had absolutely nothing to do with it. I don't think we ever talked about comics when she was here at NYU. It's like a case of parallel evolution. It took me completely by surprise, but I'm absolutely delighted by it. So Martha is a professor of comparative literature in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at Bryant University. And with Dave Ball, she co-edited The Comics of Chris Ware, Drawing as a Way of Thinking, published by the University of Press of Mississippi, and has published articles on Central European authors in various journals, including Modernism and Modernity, The Comparatives, and World Literature Today. She has chapters on graphic novels in the Cambridge Guide to the Graphic Novel, Comics and Abstraction, and Approaches to Teaching the Graphic Novel. She served on the MLA Forum on Comics and Graphic Narratives from 2012-2017 and on the Comic Studies Society Executive Board from 2017 to 2019. She, like Jose, she also is a practitioner. As Jose mentioned, she drew the cover for this volume, which again, my head is off to her because if I had to draw the cover for anything, it would be a very bad stick figure. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Martha, please take it away.
All right. Thanks very much. So first of all, can you hear me and can you see my slide?
Yes.
Are we good? Terrific. All right. Well, thanks so much. Thank you, Elliot. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be speaking through the Jordan Center through NYU. Also, thanks to Jose and Biz. And I think it's extraordinary that this book came together mostly virtually. Some of the contributors I have not met in person, and we just exchanged drafts, and Jose and I talked at length about what the themes were and all of that. But, you know, this was a transnational production, and I'm really proud of the fact that many of our contributors are from the region. I think that's fantastic. So I'm not going to talk too much about the overall book, except to say, or to orient my chapter within it. And in the introduction, we do talk about some themes that I feel cut across a lot of the chapters. And a few of them are translation, transnationalism, the problem of authenticity. Biz kind of touched on that when you talk about photographs or artifacts, notion of history and counter history. And this is what Jose talked about. Also, nostalgia and Ostalgie, which is the German case. And what I would emphasize in this particular presentation is more the transnational aspect of Vojtěch's work, because he's a filmmaker. He doesn't really come from a tradition of comics. And that means that he's relatively free to break the rules. And he comes up with a very unique style that I really haven't seen elsewhere. All right, did you see that second slide? Are we good? Okay, so this is one of the books that I talk about. It's Slonif Marienbadu, which is a very sort of in joke, because there's last year in Marienbad, and then this notion of elephants, loni means like last year. So it's a, it's a joke between the French language and Czech and all of that, which is very Mašek because of course he knows all of film history and New Wave and this sort of thing. So Elephants in Marienbad is the first volume of a trilogy in which the plot is very, well, it's kind of Kafka-like. There's a main character named Damien Chobot, or Damien Trunk, and he is captured by a mad scientist, and he is disfigured by this mad scientist. And so we follow him, but at the same time, it's called the Monster Cabaret. And so it's as if it were a cabaret show. And I also think Monster Cabaret is probably a reference to Cabaret Voltaire, right? Because the other piece of this is that it's very much in dialogue with the avant-garde. So in this first example, there are sections throughout the book that tell jokes about Kafka. So here is Joseph Lipnik and Hermann Schlechtfreund, which is a great name, meaning Herman, bad friend, and little Josef, who is very obsequious. And Hermann is trying to advise Josef about what he should write. And so he comes and he wants to be published very much. And so Hermann, I'm not sure how well you can read this, but he says, well, how should I begin? And he says, one day or one morning, how should I know? What's his face? Some name, maybe Gregor. One morning, Gregor Samsa awoke and discovered he had been turned into some kind of gigantic insect. See, it writes itself, but that's Kafka. No, it's only the beginning. No one will recognize it. The metamorphosis begins that way. And so this goes on. This is sort of this absurd exchange that happens throughout and kind of punctuates the action. But here's a more typical page. And I think this is also what I mean by the unconventional aesthetics, because it's very collage in format. There's drawing, there are photographs. He draws on the photographs. And what's happening here is Damien is watching a propaganda film about tractors and agriculture and progress and all of this. But there's this part where the narration changes and the narrator is suggesting that we should all get trunkified, so to speak. And here you see this involves a kind of grotesque elongation of the nose, and here a lovely drawing of someone's nose getting pulled off. And this becomes a kind of a metaphor for indoctrination, sort of through this grotesque exaggeration. And this is his predicament. So he undergoes this crazy transformation and then tries to make his way in the world. And I immediately also thought of Jan Švankmajer, who's a very famous Czech animation filmmaker. And the film in particular that I thought of was Dimensions of Dialogue from 1982, where you see these two figures, they kind of melt into each other through the clay and they come together. So initially this is a loving relationship, but then towards the end, they actually tear each other apart. So Švankmajer kind of dealing with this also potentially political satire here, and the way these bodies are very flexible and infinitely malleable and kind of monstrous. And again, returning to this transnational theme, it's very much about these connections to the avant-garde, and Mašek really leans on that quite a bit. So in the beginning, there's some fuss and craziness, and you see the little baby down here saying, oh, it's cute Dada, right? And there are many, many references to Dada which is appropriate because it's put together in a collage format. It's not as though the panels are drawn in a rectangle the way you would normally expect. It's much more of a tactile surface. And that recalls, well, not only say Czech surrealism and Czech photo collage, but also other examples of Dada like Raoul Hausmann, the art critic. I also like this comparison because here you see you have not only the photographs, but there's drawing on the photographs. And this is what Mašek does. He draws and actually changes, using gouache, he changes the expressions and makes the figures into these more fantastical, grotesque kind of figures. So the first trilogy was more sort of a sci-fi mashup between, I don't know, David Lynch and science fiction, and also this critique of ideology, but it's all fictional. And this one is a different project, which came out of a series called České století, Czech Century. And there are 10 volumes. This one is just the 1952 one. And this is about the show trials in the 1950s, which I'm told are also called like Monster Proces, as monstrous trials that took place in the 50s. How Gottwald murdered Slansky. This is 10 years later. And the central metaphor here is Slansky. Again, there's this grotesqueness where there's this infinite pliability, and he works with this metaphor. You see these horns sprouting out of his head, and this seems to be a reference to the notion of a scapegoat or a sacrificial lamb or something like this. Because what happens to Slansky is everyone turns against him, and he is forced into a false confession, and then he is executed in a really dramatic and awful way. So Mašek works with that idea. And then I also really enjoy the way he uses these tendrils, and this happens throughout the book. They are almost like wires that connect various people. And here they're contemplating how they're going to arrest Slansky, and things are not looking very good for him. Some of these are actual historical figures, and he's painted over them and altered them in various ways. This is Slansky, and this little picture here kind of reminds me again of surrealism. You see there's no face, it's broken open. In Chien Andalou, for instance, you have the hand that has this opening in it, and the ants come out, and it kind of reminded me of that type of scene. Also this kind of terrifying face that's just a fingerprint. So things are not going well. And here, this is the worst moment for Slansky, where the Soviet advisors have all turned against him. And it's a combination of word and image. So those the trunk-like forms that we had in the Monster Cabaret series now become these beaks or swords that pierce Slansky. And right here, this says traitor, right? So that spells out traitor, Zradce, as they corner him and he has nowhere to go. These end papers also continue that theme, and they're very unsettling because on the one hand, they could be wires, but maybe they're entrails, or maybe they're spaghetti, or I don't know, but this punctuates the narrative. And also, again, kind of brings him closer to working with the texture of the page and a more painterly effect. So another project he did that takes some aspects from the Monster Cabaret and puts them in a different form was Recycle Literature from 2014, which is really playful. And it was also more participatory because well, first of all, he would cut up little snippets of text and then attach them to old photographs. But it was not only Vojtěch Mašek himself, he would have these workshops where he would have large tables set out and old magazines and clippings, and people were invited to assemble their own comics, kind of makeshift DIY comics. So here you have this gentleman kind of leaning in, almost as if this is a perfume commercial. He's like, oh, what's that? What is it? And she says, garlic, sort of deflating that moment. I like this one very much. The moose is saying, you can't imagine how stressed I am, off there in the snowy wilderness. And here, a little girl eyeing this dog, and the dog is saying, do you understand me even a little bit? And she says, what? So this is just this makeshift, again, sort of comics that are made by people, and again, through this cut technique, and it comes together rather spontaneously. Also, I was thinking what Biz was saying, they funded this through Facebook. This was crowdsourced, a kind of a Kickstarter project. So again, very unusual in the way they put that project together. And the last image I wanted to show, I'm very excited about this because I have this book in Czech, but I have learned that this will be published in English in the fall, Centrala, The Sisters Dietel. This is a beautiful, beautiful book. The production values are very high. And I feel as though the best parts of recycled literature and Monster Cabaret and all these other things really come together in this book, because you have collage and drawing and painting and printmaking. And he uses this detritus of newspapers and magazines and collages it together, and the color is gorgeous. So the story is again kind of about identity and monstrosity. It's about these two sisters and a case of not really knowing who's whom. There's also a detective plot, a noir plot. There's also a mad scientist. So it's sort of his typical tricks, but combined in a new way. And again, this will be the first time that his work will be available in English. So I would really urge people to check it out. And overall, I would say what really intrigues me about his work is this notion of, you know, what is monstrosity, what is normal, what is abnormal, and again, how he deals with that both in a fictional realm and also in a historical realm is really provocative. So that's all I have to say on that. And then we probably do have time to bring some of these things together.
Great, thank you, Martha. I have to say the project, it's fascinating that project on recycled comics was crowdfunded through Facebook, because all I could think of when I saw these is that it's a lot of work to make on paper something that looks a lot like internet memes. Even doing that in an analog.
That's right, you're the king of memes. That's true, that's true. But he's very tactile. I mean, he's very avant-garde, old school, art school. I think that's really his frame of reference.
Yeah, he's making internet memes the way Grandpa used to. Absolutely. So this has all been really great, and I'm going to open it up for questions. But first, I want to take advantage of my role as moderator here to ask the first kind of broad question here, which comes from reading this book, hearing your presentations, and being a lifelong comics reader here in North America. You know, Jose talked about how Baranko is preoccupied with alternate history, and one of the things that I get out of this stuff is I feel like I'm watching and I'm looking at the alternate history of comics themselves, right? Compared to what I've grown up in. And in particular, I look at all these comics from Comics of New Europe, and I have a reaction that I think is kind of obvious, but worth dwelling on for a second, that these comics seem really European. That is, it almost seems as they produced as if the heroic fantasy of North America and Japan, say Jack Kirby and Tezuka, never existed. And since you guys are giving us sort of the beginnings of a sense of the canon of these comics cultures that are unavailable to most of us. I was wondering if any of you could say something about what the role of these artists are, what the role of comics culture is in these countries, in what I assume is the absence of a large-scale, heroic, fantastic mainstream like we have in the two biggest comics cultures in North America and the United States. I mean, what kind of niche do these creators have in a comics culture that I presume is completely different and more arts comics focused than what we would take for granted, say, in North America? If any of you would like to take a stab at that.
I could start.
I just wanted to say bye and thank you because I have to teach, unfortunately. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so
and
much.
I really wish I could
Great to
participate
see
in the
you.
questionnaire, but I hope I receive some emails after the fact. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. All right, so the question is, these look much more like, well, I think they look much more like alternative. Some of them look much more like alternative comics. So for example, in my graphic novel class, I'm going to talk about Raw next time. And that's a very different trend, even in an American context, that really comes more out of fine art or popular art. The other thing I would say is maybe they're trying to react a little bit against the superhero comics hegemony and Franco-Belgian comics, and trying to do something that is both in dialogue, so different from that. And I think they do actually struggle to produce and make these comics financially viable. I mean, a lot of the chapters talk about how there was a boom and then a lot of these industries, these little publishing houses would close because they didn't have enough people buying them. And I think that part of the problem is they need to be translated into more languages, quite frankly, so they have a larger market. But I don't know, Jose, what would you like to add to that?
What's interesting from what you said is it sounds like that, you know, of course, obviously American alternative comics do come to mind, but that these are kind of alternative comics, but they're an alternative to something that's not in their own country, but a foreign and hegemonic tradition. Jose, please, go ahead.
Jose, did you want to say something?
Are you?
Yeah. Sorry about that. No, Elliot, I was saying that what you just said is maybe a little bit too much of a generalization, in that it really kind of depends on which country, and we have such differences between these countries. There's also different periods, right? A little bit, even though most of what we're examining in the book is closer to present day. And this was something Martha and I also discussed, like what period did we want to talk about, right? Because there were comics being published in Poland and even in Czechoslovakia, right, in the post-war period. So I mean, but we're not examining them. Or even a series in Czechoslovakia like Štěrlístek was tremendously popular. Obviously, it would be what you would consider much more mainstream. It's kind of like children's comics. And some of the other chapters we did not consider today, like Mihaela Prikup's work on autobiographical comics in Romania, or Alexander Sekulich's work on Vostok in Serbia. Vostok, I think, is an interesting example, somebody who's clearly coming out of the alternative scene, even the underground scene, you could say, but also is working with imagery like Mickey Mouse, I think, in interesting ways, and other kind of corporate symbols. If I could share my screen again real quick, I can talk, I think, in the case of Ukraine again here. What I mentioned very briefly before is Dahopak, which is, I think, an interesting version of a superhero, right? That's very, very national, right? And very particular to Ukrainian culture. And as I mentioned in my caption here, it's really a kind of nationalistic project to bring a sense of Ukraine's history, Ukrainian culture, and the ways in which you can use this hyper-masculine image of the Cossack in all sorts of different events. I mean, they're superheroes, Elliot, just by another name, really. And so I think they are learning some of these lessons from what a more kind of global trends in comics publishing from other countries. So I do think that in general, yes, we're focusing on material that does tend to, is very European, as you're saying, and that it is very much of their own traditions. But if one were to look maybe a little bit more broad, more widely, right, in any of these countries, I think you would find children's comics that are a little bit more like children's comics in the US. Maybe not superheroes, although as we know, Russia has its own successful superhero company, Bubble, which is sort of the Russian Marvel and very much bills itself that way. So there's been other similar attempts in places like the Czech Republic and Poland. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a qualified yes.
Great.
Can I just add one other thing? So Mašek and Baban, the two guys who did this Monster Cabaret series, which, by the way, was initially just something they did on the side while they were in film school, but turned into this really terrific project. There's a Radio Prague interview where they describe the character as an anti-superhero. And so they're kind of referring to that, but more in an ironic sense, like let's turn it upside down. I also want to say that Damien with his trunk, initially that seems like a deformation, but the trunk turns out to be the way he defeats the evil General Chobot. So, even that notion of like what is grotesque, what is connotation as negative or positive, having a trunk turns out to be a good thing in the end of that story, which is also really, really great.
Wow. Fantastic. Wonderful. So Emily had a question in chat. Emily, would you like to ask it yourself? If so, Sasha, can you unmute her? Otherwise I can read it, but Emily, why don't you speak? Oh, good, there you are, Emily. So Sasha, will you unmute? Oh, there we go.
Thanks, everyone. I have a pretty banal question. I definitely will look for this volume and for the works that have already been published and translated in North America. But do any of you have any sites or stores that you would recommend for those of us who don't know where to find comics of the New Europe?
Aha! So I did send to Elliot and Sasha a link. We have a coupon code so that you can actually buy it. So it's distributed by Cornell University Press. And I don't know if Sasha can get that or if I should dig it up, but we'll answer that question.
But I think part of the question is also where you can find more comics, more actual primary sources from.
Right. That's harder. Yeah, that's harder. I don't know. I've heard that Forbidden Planet just closed in New York. Is that true?
What?
I think so. I mean, I haven't seen it for a while, I must admit. I think everything's closed, so.
Yeah, it's really depressing. I mean, that was a landmark when I was a teenager, Forbidden Planet, and that's where they had European comics. So I think mostly I have to get my comics through mail order, or when I was in Prague, I would buy them in person in bookstores. I know that doesn't help, but I think you have to find an independent comics store, where you live. Otherwise you buy them online. I don't know, Jose, what do you do?
Well, I can recommend one of the publishers that Martha mentioned that's doing the Mašek translation. That's Centrala. That is a Polish publisher, but they've had an office in London, and they've really been accelerating in the last few years their translations into English, which is wonderful. Even things that are not Polish. So I would look at their site, and I'm most conversant with the stuff available in Russia. Comixology has some Russian stuff available. It's more mainstream, like Bubble and similar things like that. But if you really want to, especially if you read Russian, I would recommend the website of Boom Kniga, which is the leading alternative comics press. They've done remarkable, wonderful work over the last 10 years, translating a lot of stuff from basically global comics heritage into Russian, things like Persepolis, things like Epileptic by David B. and a lot of stuff. Tilly Walden, they've translated. So there's a lot of, as well as a lot of native Russian material, but they don't do it in translation. They do it in Russian.
You know, one of the things that I've been frustrated by, actually, like when I go to their site and look, when I read your work and find out about more Russian comics and go look for them, is how sort of surprising, given the way that texts circulate in Russia, at least, how little of this is available digitally, which is unfortunate given the access questions. Is this primarily a fear of piracy?
You know, I think partly it's been a lot of, speaking of precarity, a lot of anxiety on the part of Russian publishers up until recently. Yes, partly piracy, but partly also just the sense that there is that Russian comics are not really a sure proposition yet. And I think that that's translated into a lot of caution. The other thing I was going to say for the questioner is that if another possibility is if a lot of the stuff is not been translated into English, but it is in French. So a number of material, including Mašek, including a lot of Russian stuff, actually has made it into the French market. So if you can read French, you can access it that way.
The French translate everything. It's the same with the literature from the region too. If you can read French, you have a gateway to the world.
Yeah, and this was also, speaking of translation, it was another really perennial problem that Martha and I have also, I think, mentioned at conferences like the Comic Studies Society conference, the last one that was held in person in Toronto, where there was a wonderful talk by Nina Mikvitz, a British comic scholar, kind of really bemoaning the fact that we talk about the transnational turn, we talk about the importance of kind of getting everybody to see this wonderful material, but there's just such a paucity of translations. Yeah. And then I myself have been trying, I was on sabbatical last year, and I did my due diligence. I brought 3 projects, 3 important Russian comics works to a number of publishers, and they all just, didn't give a damn. So it's hard to, I always said, I'll do it for free. I'm happy to do it. And some really major works that people should be reading, but including one of them that I call The Russian Mouse, Survilo by Olga Lavrentieva. But and that just came out a few months ago in French. So I'm just really just angry about that, really. And I know, Martha, you've had similar.
I had the same. Yeah, I had the same experience. I think, we need to find a special publishing house that will do more, I don't know, academic translations. I'm not sure. It's a real problem. I agree.
Or maybe a digital route might be more, if you're willing to do it for free, might be more possible.
Yeah. So maybe under the Jordan Center imprint, Elliot.
I was going to say, you guys set up a publishing company, the Comics of the New Europe Publishing Company. I want to point out in the chat that Ala Roylance writes that Ohio State and UC San Diego have great collections of graphic novels from many countries, and NYU has also started buying graphic novels from Russia, Poland, and the Czech Republic. So the library system, interlibrary loan, can be a really good way of finding these works, assuming you can actually read them, which is always the big issue here. So there was a question in the chat from Teo. Teo, would you like to ask your question yourself? Sasha, will you ask Teo to unmute?
Sure.
I think Teo's on screen.
There we go.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm actually calling by invitation from Biz, and I'm calling from Finland, so it's like after midnight here. But yeah, I came to the event just because I'm currently writing my MA thesis about like Balkan immigration from the perspective of comics, and I was actually like interested, like if you've come across like any more prominent academic works, kind of like combining those 2 fields, like Balkan studies or like Balkans and comics in some sort of way. I know it's not exactly part of the scope of the book, but you also have like countries like Yugoslavia and Romania, which are part of the region. But yeah, that's kind of like what I was wondering.
I can recommend one of our contributors is Michaela Prikup of Romania, and she's written both in our volume, but then also she's had a few other articles here and there. So I would follow up with some of that, and she's doing some fabulous work. Although her one book that she's put out is not about Romanian comics. It's about, I believe, American and European. But she's great. The work, probably Alexander Zograf is the former Yugoslav comics author that's had the most exposure and the most written about him. So I would look at some of the articles like that that have already been done on him, as well as our material. But yeah, I'm not too certain beyond that myself. If anybody knows of others.
So Jose, is there a Balkan comics study group, or I'm probably confusing that with a different one? There's a Scandinavian comics study group. You were involved in some group with Biz. I can't remember, what was that called?
From what I remember, it was something that it was a website that was trying to put together scholarship generally from the area, but I don't recall too much there about the Balkans.
Okay.
There's one other person from Bulgaria that I'm forgetting that also maybe wrote something about this, but I can connect with you if you want to email me, Teo. You can.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, I'm Bulgarian as well, so it's going to be I'm Bulgarian as well, so it's going to be quite easy to talk with that person.
Okay, so that person might have. I forget who it was.
What is the best way that I can get in contact with you?
You can just write down my name, José Alaniz 23@gmail.com.
Okay, perfect.
Let me write it in the chat.
Yeah, great. So this isn't quite the level of scholarship, but where I tend to find like little pieces here and there written about comics in the Balkans and Eastern Europe and elsewhere is occasionally through links on tcj.com, the Comics Journal, and occasionally little small features on, say, Calvert Journal. But it's very sparse.
Yeah, I've noticed. There's not much overall.
Yeah. In the chat.
And look at the bibliography in our book as well.
Yeah, perfect. Great, thank you.
In the chat, Karen Green writes, Columbia University also has a substantial collection. This is a classic NYU Columbia moment. Also has a substantial collection. NYU Slavic Librarian consulted with us when she started their collection. So, so both places and Interlibrary Loan are good places to go looking for things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question or comment they would like to make about the comics of Inner Europe? Well, in that case, we have remarkably fit in the time frame that we designated here since it's 6:13. So I would just like to thank Jose and Martha and Biz, who's not here, and everybody really for attending this fantastic presentation. I encourage you all to go out and find this book, buy this book, tell other people to read the book, and find those comics that you can read, or as I think Emily put in the chat, just look through the pictures. I mean, that's the stereotype, right? Why not go with it? Just read the pictures because there's a wealth of material out there for you. So thank you again for letting us know a little bit about this comics world that is so unknown to most of us.
Thanks so much, Elliot.
Thank you again
Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot, the Jordan Center, and thank you, Martha, for lighting the spark.
Right on.